This podcast is presented by Regions Bank. You're chasing your goals, and it's up to you how you want to get there. Let Regions Bank coach you with financial tips that fit your everyday grind. Visit regions.com/next-step to learn more. Regions, member FDIC.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. My guest this week is Max Olson, national college football writer from The Athletic. We'll hit on some interesting news in college football that has broke over the last few days, starting in Alabama. Longtime strength and conditioning coach Scott Cochran is leaving Nick Saban to join Kirby Smart at Georgia. What does this mean for Alabama, Georgia, and Cochran long-term? Colorado has a new coach in Karl Dorrell. Who saw that coming? And I'll talk to Max about a story he wrote about how the NCAA might need to tweak rules regarding number of scholarships a team can hand out on a yearly basis, if it also has plans to make less restrictive transfer rules. Thanks for listening to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. You can find us on Westwood One Podcast, at Apple Podcast, and just about anywhere you like to get your podcast. Please subscribe, and if so inclined, give us a good review. It helps college football fans find us, and it helps us find more college football fans. And away we go. Joining me on the podcast this week, recurring guest, Max Olson from The Athletic, national college football writer. Max, thank you very much for taking a little time out of your offseason to talk a little news, a little transfers, and whatever else is going on in college football. How has your offseason gone?
Man, I'll be honest with you. It doesn't really feel like an offseason yet. You know what I mean? Like it's like I start to see these pictures pop up on my tweet deck of like, oh, Stanford and Vanderbilt and Texas Tech are practicing, and it's just like, come on, give us a break, give us a little time off here, you know?
Yeah, not to mention you do a lot of hard work around signing day, and you look back at the classes true. And things like that, which are very good, which are excellent work, and that's a lot more intensive than I prefer to be in January and March January and February after the season is over.
That's good. I admire your ability to kick your feet up a little bit in January, because it's just such a 12-month sport now. Yeah. Just every year it feels a little more, and then of course you have rare deals like this where you have a coaching search that goes on into late February and stuff, and it's just like now it's spring ball and then it's the draft.
Amazingly, right, there was still an FBS team looking for a Power 5 team looking for a head coach as spring ball was starting for other teams. Right, as spring ball had begun around the country, there was an FBS opening. And if you want to look at the coaching carousel, because that's what really in some ways that defines the season, the coaching carousel started on September 29th when Chris Ash got fired.
Oh, my gosh.
And it closed on February 22nd, I believe it was, right? A couple of days ago when Mel Tucker became official. February 24th. It was yesterday morning. We are recording this on a Tuesday. It was yesterday morning when that became official, or maybe it was Sunday morning.
Karl Dorrell at Colorado. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, Karl Dorrell at Colorado. And, of course, now big news becomes assistant coaches moving. Like that stuff that used to be sort of just in the transaction wire is now something that gets covered a little more intently. And I want to start here. One of the more fascinating moves of the offseason came about 24 hours before we're recording this podcast, and that is Scott Cochran, the longtime strength and conditioning coach for Nick Saban. He has been Saban's lieutenant. He has been his right-hand man. There is only one other thing more consistent at Alabama, over the Saban era. Other than Saban, it's Scott Cochran. He is leaving Alabama to become an on-the-field coach at Georgia for Kirby Smart. The assumption has been special teams because they have an opening there. it's hard to get my mind around how big a deal this is. I'm wondering, when you sort of heard the news and have had a few hours to process it, what do you think is going on here?
Yeah, I think I was in some interviews yesterday when this was going down, and I stepped out and saw that on Twitter, and I think I responded with the exploding head emoji because I just couldn't believe it. I mean, look, this has been a possibility in past years. Because of how close Scott Cochran and Kirby Smart are. We remember, we've heard stories of people trying to make a run at Cochran. I believe even Lane Kiffin tried to when he went to Ole Miss. But it's hard to what's even like the sports comparison for Ralph to help people understand what it means when Nick Saban and Scott Cochran are no longer working together. Like I can't even think of like a sports parallel to that.
I'm trying to think of in the NFL, like, was there an assistant who was with a head coach for such a long time that in some ways the assistant became just as important? Dick LeBeau is a guy who was a defensive assistant for a long time in the NFL, and he was very successful, but he also was at a couple of different places. He was at the Steelers. I think he was at the Bengals. Mm-hmm. I mean, is it? Are you a big baseball?
It's like if Oprah and Gail stopped being friends or something. Like honestly, there's not even because it's not just it's just like an all-time great duo in college football, and maybe a lot of fans don't maybe totally understand that. But that is how highly Scott Cochran is regarded inside that program, and regarded by people who have to face Alabama. That this guy is. This is the guy that runs the program throughout the offseason, and clearly the results have been unbelievable.
Right, because he's not just the guy building up the bodies, going through the mat drills and telling you how much to lift on Tuesdays. He is, and this has become the case throughout college football. And in many ways, it started with Mickey Mariotti, who's the equivalent for Urban Meyer for many years. As a strength and conditioning coach. And this is the model, and Cochran is sort of one of the people who sort of made this model, which is your strength and conditioning coach sets the tone for your program, sets the culture for your program, and to a certain degree becomes the voice of the head coach when the head coach is not supposed to be around. Whatever the head coach's agenda is, when the head coach can't be around at certain times of the year, when he can't be around the players, the strength and conditioning coach is the person who's implementing the head coach's off-season vision. And that's what Scott Cochran has been.
That's those guys have kind of created that model where where it's Mariotti or Cochran, where you're the head coach essentially of the program from January through July, with the exception of spring ball. And so this is, when we all love to talk about culture and all that kind of stuff. That guy's the culture. He is the culture. He sets the culture. And, certainly, so there's lots of different ways to break that down. I think the first thing that comes to mind for me, though, is you have to admire it as a chess move for Kirby Smart, because that's what it is. It's kind of immaterial whether Scott Cochran is an expert in special teams. It really doesn't matter. I mean, the fact is you are not only are you bringing him into your program to make everyone better and putting him on the road, which I think is going to be really fascinating. I think he'll be very effective as a recruiter, but you are also taking away an unbelievable advantage from one of the programs that stands in your way of competing for national championships, right? So it's almost, for if you're Kirby Smart's point, from his point of view, it's a huge addition to Georgia's program, but it's an even bigger loss for Alabama.
And the thing I have had a hard time grasping, and I don't think it's possible to answer this. I really don't. I don't think it's possible to sort of quantify, because we're trying to do it now. It's a huge loss, but because Cochran has been there for such a long time, and because Alabama is the monster that it is, and it loses a lot of other pieces and just keeps rolling along as a death machine. Mm-hmm. So I can't help but wonder, at this point, are things rolling? In other words, is the culture that Cochran has helped put in place, is that now so strong that it doesn't necessarily need the guy? In other words, at a certain point, has what you created become so good? It's not about you; it's about the structure. And I'm not saying like I don't think either of us can answer this here. That's a to be determined. But that's what's fascinating. Like what is the value of Scott Cochran to Alabama? And I'm sorry to be long-winded, but can that value be transferred to Georgia, or is Georgia's value simply getting him away from Alabama? And even if he doesn't provide the same value to Georgia, it's still a win for Georgia.
Yeah, there's a lot of different it's just such a fascinating topic because there's a lot of different aspects to that. One of them is, we all sort of watch in amazement from year over year as Alabama's coaching staff is constantly being shaken up, constantly guys moving on to better jobs or guys being processed out and replaced with better coaches and stuff. And we wonder, how does Alabama succeed without stability on their coaching staff? Well, Cochran and Saban are why. Now you bring up something that's important here, and that is to point out that Scott Cochran held that role for 13 years, right? And so I think it would be natural for some people to maybe have the opinion that, maybe it was time for a new voice in that room, right? I think that's probably the Alabama spin is, Cochran did an unbelievable job, but 13 years is a long time for anybody. And maybe it's time for players to hear a new voice in there. And certainly Alabama, that strength job opening up, you're going to get a few resumes for that one, right? That's probably the best job in the country in terms of, in a lot of ways. They probably can pay more than people. I believe they've just opened up an entire, sports science facility and stuff like that. And so if you're Nick Saban, you say, all right, we'll go out and get the best strength coach in the country and keep doing what we do and give them the resources. And now it'll be interesting to see, can that be a smooth transition? But certainly, I can understand the Alabama spin. I think it's dishonest for Alabama folks to spin him as, oh, he was kind of overrated and stuff, because he wasn't. But I can understand the point of view of, look, this is Alabama. Everyone's replaceable when you have Nick Saban in charge, right? And so we can go out and get the best and maybe get even better.
I think about what Scott Cochran also brings to the idea, what he brings to Alabama, or what he has been bringing to Alabama, not just from the sense of what voice he gives to the players. In other words, what he means in relationship to the players. What does it mean to Saban if you no longer have your confidant, if you no longer have this person who is very much in tune to your vision? And I think back to when Ryan Day took over for Urban, when Urban was suspended last year or 2 years ago now. And I remember talking to Mickey Mariotti about this, and he had said, listen, because again, Urban and Mickey Mariotti are of the same brain almost to a certain degree. So when things were in really troublesome times at Ohio State, Mickey sort of stepped up to Ryan Day and said, listen, I got you on this. Like, we'll make sure the kids are doing the right things, and you can just concentrate on getting the game plans together and getting your stuff together. And then when they made that transition, Mickey and Ryan had become super close already, and it was easier for the Ohio State program to transition away from Urban Meyer because Mickey was still there. So again, I only say that to sort of bring across just how important these people can be. And if Scott Cochran has that role, what I guess I wonder is, how much does Saban need that confidant? How much does Saban need that lieutenant level person who is not just working the kids out, but providing a vision or seeing Saban's vision in a way that maybe he anticipates it, right? And what does that mean to all the other coaches and all the other facets of that program? It's just it'll be really hard to quantify. But I guess from a human,
I think you're right. I think in that situation, isn't the trust more important than the talent when it comes to that coach?
That's what I guess. Let's think of it from a human level. I think to a certain degree, we look at Saban as something of a robot, so we sort of forget that he has human feelings. Like, I wonder if Saban is hurt. I wonder if Saban is upset. I wonder if Saban feels like he's losing something that is more than just a coach in this situation. Like, is he losing a friend on a level that listen, Saban's also getting up there. Is this something that he looks at and we'll look at maybe 5 years from now and say, yeah, that's probably when he started thinking about retiring, which may sound like huge jump to conclusion, but you do sort of wonder, what does this mean to what Nick Saban looks at for the rest of his career, and that he has lost this person who is really, really important to him.
Yeah. Look, I think back to a couple years ago. I remember, I think in the first recruiting cycle where we had the early signing period and when Georgia was really rolling, Georgia had the number one recruiting class in the country, and Alabama was in the top 10, but was not close to number one there. And it was made very clear to everybody, look, Georgia's going to go out and do what Alabama's been doing, right? They are gunning for the Tide, and they are having a ton of success in recruiting. And I remember, Nick Saban shook up his staff quite a bit after that. And I think Alabama still ended up finishing with the number one recruiting class at the end of that cycle. But I think it's healthy in some ways for Nick Saban, like, to have Georgia and now certainly obviously LSU, kind of pushing you to evolve and improve and like, kind of don't you think that kind of gives Nick Saban some juice to, when he gets up on this Tuesday morning after losing Scott Cochran, to be pissed at Georgia and to say, all right, they're gunning for us. What are we going to do to get better? Like, I think that's healthy when you've been as dominant as Alabama has had, to have different motivations pop up.
That's a great point, Max. That's an awesome point. The idea that now, listen, I think it's already been well established, right, that Georgia was coming for Alabama, and that what happened with LSU is LSU actually caught Alabama, which hasn't happened in a long time. So we already knew the theme going into this season, short term, just going into this season, was sort of Alabama reasserting itself. That there's going to be a lot of stories, even though it's only been 1 year that Alabama didn't make the playoff. My God, catastrophe in Tuscaloosa. There will be a lot of stories about how certain kids came back. Najee Harris came back. A few guys came back who maybe we thought weren't going to come back, and that the theme will be Alabama is looking to restore itself after 1 year of getting knocked off. And you do wonder if now this is a way of Saban not just saying, oh my gosh, my friend is gone, who am I going to trust? How am I going to replace this guy? But it's a way, the ultimate competitor, the uber competitive Saban, now looking at this going, okay, this is not a problem. I will just now figure out a way to win without him, and that's a new challenge for me.
Same thing, and we mentioned LSU here, but like, you think when LSU beat him this year and Ed Orgeron's in his locker room saying, F them, we're going to take all their recruits and all that stuff, you got to think that's getting the juices flowing for Nick Saban a little bit, to know we got to avenge this, and we got to, restore the order a little bit, right?
No doubt. And the other great thing you mentioned about Cochran going into an on-field role, which means that he can recruit on the road. Can't do that if you're a strength and conditioning coach, though I'm sure he was a pivotal part of the recruiting pitch when they were getting guys onto campus, no doubt. But I think that's the most fascinating part of this, that he potentially, and we don't get a chance to talk to Scott Cochran much because you don't talk to assistants at Alabama. They're off limits. Mm-hmm. But because they're in the playoff all the time, there are media days where all the assistants are forced to be available. So once a year, we at least get to talk to Scott Cochran. And you realize when you get those opportunities, he has the makings of being a potentially excellent recruiter.
Well, let's take it a step further, Ralph. Like, what if you're Scott Cochran and you're kind of sizing up these opportunities? I mean, doesn't it make sense for him in the back of his head to say, if I go take this job at Georgia, what if this gets me on the path to, becoming a head coach? Right. I mean, that's something that's a leap that you just don't ever see in this industry, for a guy to go from, renowned strength coach to, the head job. That's something we've never seen, and you're never going to see a strength coach get hired straight out of that role into head job. But if you're Scott Cochran and you've watched how things are done at Alabama for more than a dozen years, and you know how to bring the energy to a program like that, like if he can do this for a few years and rise up a bit, wouldn't that be I mean, how significant would that be if a Scott Cochran could be in the mix for jobs like that?
It sounds a little weird because it hasn't happened before, but the more we talk about what a head football coach at a college program is and realize coaching the coaches, creating the culture, cultivating a brand, frankly, recruiting, but overseeing an operation that is a recruiting department that is now dozens of people between personnel, assessing the personnel, and doing all the media and marketing that it takes to get your message out. You know, we've always talked about how coaches are CEOs, going back to the Bobby Bowden days, but it was always sort of done so in a colloquial way. Now it's more literal. I mean, these guys really are CEOs, and if it's all about creating the culture, cultivating a brand, who is better to do that than a person who has been in charge of that? That has been Scott Cochran's job, more so than anybody else. Writing up ball plays is going so far down on your list of qualifications for head coach. Maybe Scott Cochran is the perfect guy to, down the road, become a head coach.
Well, I mean, look, if a coach puts in 2 or 3 years as an offensive coordinator or defensive coordinator at Alabama, they're probably going to get a head coaching job off that, and it's probably going to be a job in the SEC, right? Like, we all know that ADs are certainly very eager to hire Nick Saban's, off of Nick Saban's coaching tree and people that have come from Alabama. So, why hire someone like Sark who has a couple of years there when you could hire the guy who helped build the whole thing? It's
a fascinating conversation on what Scott Cochran means. And again, I think we'll have a better we can all speculate, and it's fun to speculate what it might mean to Alabama and what it might mean to Georgia and where this could lead Scott Cochran. But really trying to figure out the actual value here is something that maybe in 2 or 3 years we'll get a much greater idea of what this move meant and the ramifications of throughout the SEC. So I want to take a quick break here. I'm talking to Max Olson, national college football writer for The Athletic. Come back, hit on one other news item, and then I wanted to touch on with Max his work on the new transfer rule and what it means to numbers and scholarships and other changes that may come into effect if indeed more athletes, more players are allowed to transfer without sitting out a year. You're listening to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast, and we'll be back right after this.
This podcast is presented by Regions Bank. You're chasing your goals, and it's up to you how you want to get there. Let Regions Bank coach you with financial tips that fit your everyday grind. Visit regions.com/next-step to learn more. Regions, member FDIC.
And we're back on the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. I am talking with Max Olson of The Athletic. So, Max, the other bit of news that's come about in the period between my last podcast and this podcast is CU. As we talked about earlier, Colorado finally hired a head coach, so the coaching carousel is done. Boy, like if you had told me to list like 100 guys who could get the Colorado job, I am fairly confident Karl Dorrell would not be on my list of guys I would have expected to get the Colorado job. Give me your reaction when, I think it was Pete Thamel who broke the news ultimately that Dorrell was the guy. When you saw that tweet or that when you opened up, flipped up on your phone and you saw that news making the rounds, what was your reaction?
Really? I suppose that would be my reaction when you see that news pop. Look, one thing that we all do in the off season is like assign grades to coaching hires, and certainly like this is a complicated hire to grade because of the timing being just absolutely brutal to have to make a hire unexpectedly in late February. I don't think that Rick George ever could have seen that scenario. You can't anticipate that. You got to have a list ready in case that ever happens. But even in February, it's hard to get the people at the top of your list in that situation. And as you saw, it was interesting to see some of the names that were sort of attached to this job. It seemed like this search was going to go on a little bit longer. it looked for a minute like maybe it would be Sark or Troy Calhoun. And then suddenly it seemed like maybe that wasn't going to be the case, and maybe they're going to go in a different direction. I didn't think Karl Dorrell would be that direction. Didn't see that coming. It doesn't mean it's a horrible hire, because ultimately, they found someone who's familiar with Boulder and who's had some success in Boulder as a coordinator. But that was from 95 to 98. That was a very long time ago. And now because of the fact that Mel Tucker has taken pretty much his whole staff to East Lansing with him, Karl Dorrell is in a really tough spot here, where you got to hire a staff quickly and then boom, get ready for spring ball. I feel for these players that they have to go through this transition, and boy, it's going to be this year one is going to be fascinating for Karl Dorrell, and I don't know, like how do you turn that into a really successful first year when kind of these things are stacked against you like that? Yeah,
they are literally weeks away from starting spring ball. They're less than a month than starting spring ball at Colorado. I think it's easy to sort of make fun of the move, honestly, and I think at least a few people might have, because again, he hasn't coached in such a long time. He was the Dolphins receivers coach. It was a name that nobody had thought of. He did an okay job at UCLA, and in retrospect, he probably did a better job at UCLA than given credit for, considering how UCLA has done since he left. So maybe he should have gotten a little more credit for how he did it at UCLA, though, again, it was an okay job. You never know how these things are going to play out. I have told people I have gotten myself out of the grading of the hires business, because who knows, man? I mean, so often you look at a guy and think that's a perfect fit, and it works out terribly, and you look at a guy who you think, boy, I'm really skeptical about that, and it works out great. So we'll see how that plays out. The initial thoughts to me were mostly about kind of what you said, as far as where do you go from here? How do you make this a successful first season when you're throwing this all together so late? The other thing that strikes me is this, and it sort of speaks to who is in charge of hiring these coaches. And I don't mean the ADs. I mean, who are the people behind the scenes who are sort of pulling levers for their guys? Mm-hmm. And you end up with agents and headhunters sort of selling you on guys because, well, he's available and he really wants to do it. I also do wonder how much Rick George wanted to make sure he got somebody who wasn't going to pull out after 2 years. Because after just having that with Mel Tucker, to have that again, that could be a real problematic situation for your program. So how the situation came to land on Karl Dorrell, and you sort of think like, well, who's he represented by? Like, from what I've heard, he's got some representatives that are similar to Eric Bieniemy's. So maybe there was a relationship there between Rick George and the people and some agents. So you become comfortable with some people and they sell you on somebody else. If you can't get the guy you want, what about this guy? I also do think there might have been a situation where Rick George might have looked around and said, you know what? I might be able to get this young coordinator here or this up-and-comer here, but I really need to get somebody who's going to be super excited to be in this job and stay for a few years.
Yeah, but it's an interesting dilemma there, because I don't know. I can understand the AD saying, feeling burned by Mel Tucker and feeling like, I don't want to do this again 2 years from now. But at the same time, you look at kind of the 10-year run for this program, or really the run since they left the Big 12. And if you can bring in a coach who can make Colorado really successful in a couple of years, and then he has some opportunities, I think you got to go for it. I think they just need success at this point, and some somewhat sustained success. And you thought that was going to be the case with, oh God, why am I blanking on his name?
Mel Tucker?
Ralph. No, before him.
Oh, Mike McIntyre.
Mike McIntyre.
Right, Mike McIntyre.
Excuse me.
Yes, yeah.
It seemed like Mike McIntyre was going to be able to point that thing into the right direction of sustainable success, and that fell apart. But I don't know. Yeah, it's a fair point. It's a fair point that you want someone who's eager to be there. I thought when that search was like, I remember at one point Bruce reported that, well, maybe they were going to circle back and talk to an Alex Grinch or a Graham Harrell. Like, I can understand why. I think I may have preferred going in that direction for a hire, but at the same time, to those guys, like, this is probably not a very attractive job at the moment. And if you are a hot coordinator out there, it's probably, as we're coming to the end of this cycle, maybe it makes more sense to sit back and wait for next year and see what's on the table, because Colorado has some real unique challenges when you jump into that job in late February.
Yeah, and that was also the massive bind Colorado was in, simply because it's a tough job, and then you include this awkward timing, and now you're really challenging people to leave a job for your job. Like who,
and you can't even really recruit, right? Because the signing class is already locked up, and hopefully you can get those kids to
and where are you getting your assistant
right?
coaches from? I mean, that's the other thing too.
You can't go out and say, here's the guys I want to bring into this program. And look, Carl Durrell had not been coaching in college the last few years either, so there's going to be that adjustment of he was at Vanderbilt in 2014, didn't have a very successful run in his 1 year there as OC, but pretty much every job he's had otherwise since he was head coach at UCLA was in the NFL. So I think that piece of it will be an adjustment as well.
All right, let's talk about transfers and some of the numbers crunching you did. There is going to be change coming in the NCAA. It's not going to be a legislative change. It seems like the next step in the transfer saga is a change to the waiver system, which would sort of mimic the one-time exception for athletes to transfer one time without sitting out. It happens in other sports. I know, as fans of college football and college basketball may find that hard to believe, but it happens in other sports, and they're trying to recreate that in college football and college basketball. The way to do it in a short-term way is with a waiver situation where basically if you're in good standing with your school and the school doesn't have a problem with it, you can transfer and go play right away. It will open up a lot more opportunities for kids to play right away. Part of the issue with that, though, is it might also open up more or make it more likely for more kids to transfer. And it becomes a little bit of a numbers crunch when it comes to scholarships, because even if you lose a transfer, you can only sign so many kids per year. And even if you lose a transfer, you don't necessarily get that scholarship back immediately to use. So I say all that to sort of give a little background on what the numbers crunching you did and where you think this thing could be headed and what possible solutions that might need to be embedded in any transfer rules when it comes to recruiting and signing.
Yeah, so my curiosity was certainly as the news comes out that, it seems like we're heading in the direction of a one-time transfer exception. Certainly I think most people, the gut reaction to that and the fear-mongering you hear from coaches around an idea like that is oh my gosh, there's just going to be so many more guys that transfer if you give them a freebie, basically. And so I wanted to look at, well, what would happen if suddenly there were many, many more players transferring? Because we've already got a lot right now. We've already, frankly, got too many players transferring at the moment. In this cycle of it, which starts in August, of 2019, there's been more than 1,100 FBS football players who have put their names into the transfer portal. 750 of them or so are scholarship players. You look at where they're ending up. And there's still 860 players that are still active in the portal. I think that number is probably a little bit less, but still more than 800 players still waiting to find a school. And you look at where they're actually ending up, and I found that of the ones that have enrolled at schools, about 44% of them have to go to the FCS level or Division II. And even I found that there are 20 players who went into the portal as scholarship players and enrolled at schools as walk-ons because they couldn't get scholarships. So the fact that schools right now are limited to just a hard count of 25 initial counters or 25 scholarships in a recruiting class means that they really only have room to take a couple transfers in a year. And, I think unfortunately we're seeing much more than a couple players on each program going into the portal looking for a new school. And so I think the reality is, if even more players are going to go into it, and if even more premium players are going to go into the transfer portal in the future, then I think you're going to end up with an even more dramatic case where right now you're seeing about 60% of the guys that enroll at new schools are moving down a level, and I think we'll probably see even more of them. And by down, I mean Power 5 to Group of 5 or Group of 5 to FCS or whatever. I think you'll see even more of that because there's frankly just not much room on these teams' rosters to take many transfers.
And again, the reason why there's no room at the inn is if you can only sign 25 scholarship players per year.
Mm-hmm.
And that's combining that includes recruits, right? Now, part of your recruiting class can be transfers. You could save one or two of those 25, but you can't exceed 25. There's ways I think you can carry over some numbers from the year before, depending on when you might sign some guys, but it's a hard 25 cap. And again, most teams like to sign up to whatever their limit is or whatever they have available. As far as high school kids, because that's really the lifeblood of your program. You don't want to. You may save one or two, and more coaches are saying, "I am going to save one or two to see if I can get a grad transfer or a kid who might have some eligibility." So you get a little more of that depending on where you are in the development of your program. But a possible fix to at least. Well, it wouldn't fix the numbers to what you're seeing, but it could fix a little bit is the idea of, well, maybe we loosen up that number 25 as a hard cap. And there's some possible legislation to do that, which is not necessarily related to this, but it's sort of indirectly related to this.
Yeah, and that's, Jeff Long, the AD at Kansas, has been pushing for this for more than a year. He was able to get the Big 12 and the MAC to team up on this proposal, which is ready for a vote, and I imagine probably will get voted for here and enacted in time for August. But it's not that dramatic of a change. Now, what Kansas wants to do is loosen it up so instead of 25, you can take up to 30 in a year. However, because they don't want people oversigning like crazy and taking advantage of that, they still set a limit that in a 2-year period you can only sign 50. So it's really not changing the numbers that much. It's just changing that, maybe in some years you take 28 and then the next year you take 22, right? Mm-hmm. So it gives you flexibility, and you could look at it and say, well, that's just that is going to create a lot more spots for transfers potentially, but not really over a 2-year period. So, and look, the NCAA, after how Ole Miss and others took advantage of oversigning and brought together classes of 30, 35, 38 players. We're not going to go back to that.
Right. And just to make people understand, the biggest problem with that is you are clearly kicking kids out at that point.
Yes.
If you're oversigning to that degree, you are absolutely without question saying there are kids on my roster who are not going to be here anymore. And you have to work to do that.
Yeah. And so now look, from a coach's point of view, now they have their opinions on, where we're heading in terms of, they certainly are very fearful of anything that resembles free agency. But, one complaint you often hear from coaches, I understand their point of view on this is, if you're a program that has had, 3, 4, 5 players go into the transfer portal in the offseason, it makes sense for them to say, well, why shouldn't I be able to go sign 3 or 4 or 5 players to replace them, right? Mm-hmm. You would think that, how do I get that number back? Of course, the fear there and the reason why I don't think you're going to see that kind of legislation coming up here is because then you can really process your program and push 20 guys out and bring 20 guys in, right? Like that will be, you would see programs try to take advantage of that if there's kind of a 1-for-1 deal there, right? So it's tricky to kind of find the right way to do that. And right now, the reality is you end up with, even if this rule changes in August and schools can take 28 or 29 in a class, it doesn't really mean that many more players are getting spots on FBS rosters.
Yeah, I do wonder if you can come up with some way, as opposed to what you had mentioned when you say 1-for-1. So in other words, if I lose one, that means I can get one back. And you explained why that could be a little dangerous, right? Because at least from the kids' point of view, because suddenly all of a sudden, I can just start pushing kids into the portal and say, now I get that scholarship back. And trust me, that already sort of happens to a certain degree.
That's how we get over signing, absolutely.
Right. I mean, I think, one of the things that, I've had coaches tell me, especially coaches who sort of live or have spent a lot of time in that group of 5 level, and they'll tell you all the time, it's like, listen, that coach up there says he's worried about, kids leaving. And I'll tell you that I got 3 kids on my roster because they were pushed out, right?
Yeah.
Of a Power 5 program because they were sort of told that, like, listen, you can stay here or you might be better off finding a place where you might have a little more success, which essentially means, you're not going to play, but feel free to stay here, but you're not going to play.
Sure.
And we don't think much of you, so we might make it really tough on you to stay here. So that stuff it happens too. I still do wonder if there's some mechanism of you lost a guy in the portal or you lost X amount of kids, you can have a scholarship back. In other words, maybe if it's not 1-to-1, you might be able to get some relief. As far as replenishing a roster or replenishing a spot or getting a scholarship back. And listen, I think this is one of the things that's going to be discussed now as a contingency. I don't think you can have these transfer rules without having the discussion that we're having, and hopefully there'll be folks in Indianapolis who will be having it. But I do think there probably needs to come up with some kind of measure that gets you at least, that allows you to repair a little bit of the damage that could be done by mass transfers.
Yeah, I'm with you. I want to ask you this because I'm curious as we kind of look ahead to this transfer landscape with if you bring in the one-time transfer exception and basically give players the chance to leave a school and go to a new school and play right away once. Certainly like a Justin Fields or a Shea Patterson, those are pretty rare cases where like a really, a 5-star type of guy comes onto the market, in their first 2 years of their careers here. Do you think like we will see more premium players decide to make moves in early in their careers? Not as grad transfers, but early on. Like, do you think we'll see a lot more Justin Fields types if we make it that much easier to transfer? Because I'm a little bit skeptical of that, to be honest.
I am. And part of it, like you did those numbers about transferring down. There's a lot of talk that comes in the up transfer, right? And that's a term that gets used a lot in basketball more than football. Sure. But the idea that a really a Power 5 school is going to poach from a group of 5 is going to poach from the FCS, and we're going to develop the kids, and then they're going to take them away. That gets talked about a lot. But the reality is, and this is even pre-portal, a lot of the transferring is transferring down already. And a lot of the transferring, even transferring down, I think coaches that have a little bit more of a grounded sense of reality will tell you, like, listen, we talk a ton about transfers, but the vast majority of the numbers here is just depth. It's a lot of kids moving around. Very few of them are stars or even starters. The heavy movement comes from kids who, hey man, I'm not going to start here, so I got to find an easier place to play.
Right.
So that's my long-winded way of saying that. No, I don't know if you're going to see a whole lot more Justin Fields. But here's the thing: you don't need a whole lot more, even if it upticks a little bit. It's significant because it's those high-profile players are the people we see, and they have major impacts on programs. So
we react to anecdotal evidence a lot, right? Like that's because the thing you're talking about, the fear of, well, what if the Power 5 start poaching the group of 5s, right? Like people will point in this offseason to De'Aaron King going from Houston to Miami, which we all know that's a very unique circumstance there. Why De'Aaron King is choosing to leave Houston, but over time, like I remember when Garrett Dieter went from Bowling Green to Alabama, and it's like, oh, is that going to start happening a lot? It hasn't. It just hasn't. It happens a couple times every year, but it not in a really like statistically like notable way. But we do tend to kind of fall for the anecdotes, right?
Right. Well, remember when Vernon Adams, right? That was a big one. Vernon Adams transfers out of Eastern Washington, an FCS school, where he had great success, to Oregon. Right after Mariota left, he was the next Oregon quarterback, and he did okay. And it was a big deal at the time because, again, FCS coaches were up in arms. Oh, my gosh, we're going to become a farm system. Of course, not recognizing or not acknowledging the fact that so many FCS programs are built on the backbone of the FCS programs, of many FCS programs, is FBS transfers, right?
Sure.
There's all kinds,
absolutely.
kinds of kids who get phased out of FBS programs and end up in FCS because they can play right away without waivers and all that nonsense. So I do think there will be an uptick. But I guess, again, going back to your point about the anecdotes, I think the uptick might not be very big, but it will be high profile. And it will have big impact when it does happen, and it will seem more momentous. But the fact of the matter is, you know what? Go back to Eastern Washington, right? Gage Gabrud. Gabrud, yeah. So made the same move last year.
But we both may be saying it wrong.
I think we probably are. But his first name is Gage, and there's not that many quarterbacks named
It is Gage. So everybody go to Eastern Washington. I remember that. So
Eastern Washington to Washington State last year, and people thought, oh, wow, that's a great move by Washington State because they were going to be looking for a new quarterback, and he didn't start. Anthony Gordon flew by him, and it really wasn't that big of a deal. Now, I'm sure it would have been nice for Eastern Washington to have him back last year, but Eastern Washington, I'm pretty sure, made the playoffs without him anyway. So, most of the stuff that comes about with transfers, the great lesson here, the overarching lesson is there is more fear-mongering and worry about potential consequences and blowing those out of proportion than in reality when it finally happens. We will blow a lot of things out of proportion. We will fear-monger. Coaches will. We will gnash teeth and complain and worry about all this stuff. And then there'll be a few tweaks and things along those lines, and there'll be a new normal here, but it really won't be quite as, the change probably won't be quite as dramatic as we think it might be. Let me ask you something. Let me ask you about this.
I'm with you on that.
Do you think this could be the end of the grad transfer rule?
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't really thought about how, if a player does that's it, right? There's not really... that is using your grad transfer, but using it early, basically.
But not necessarily. No, not the way the rules are written right now. You'd have to change the rules. And the other thing that's also very interesting too, and you pay attention closely enough that you might see it because you have to really be a nerd and pay attention a lot, like me.
Okay.
Or have you noticed? Again, a little anecdotal. Guys like transferring more than once. Transferring and then grad transferring, because amazingly, they still have eligibility left because they're getting in so early into school, so they're graduating after 2.5 years. Maybe they transfer at one point within or they're grad transferring. They have 2 years left, and then they grad transfer again.
Yeah, I know. It's weird. You see that a lot. You see that a lot in basketball too, of guys somehow bouncing around to 4 different schools. But you do see it a little bit in college football now, and I've seen names pop up in the transfer portal where you're like, didn't that player just transfer a year ago? And yeah, it happens, and sometimes that's because the reality is sometimes that's because there's a reason why these guys are in the transfer portal, right? Whether maybe they're not going to be happy wherever they end up, or maybe they were a problem child for the school they were at, and they will continue to be that for wherever they go. But yeah, I am curious to see how many guys will start to transfer multiple times during their careers. The one thing I'm really curious to watch too, you think about, Ralph, if you had a son who was going through this, right, who was at a school and he was looking to transfer, and you just look at the numbers. Like I said, there's been more than 1,100 players have gone into the portal. Only about 1 in 4 ends up at a Power 5 school. Wouldn't you kind of encourage your son, hey, maybe reach out to some of the coaches that recruited you before you go ahead with this, and maybe feel out if you actually have a place to go before you make that decision. I feel like that's just common sense, and I kind of wonder if we're just going to continue to see more and more tampering because of this, because it kind of seems like the smart thing to do to line up where you're going to go before you decide to go.
Well, and I think there are coaches who might tell you that is still happening. But
it's happening.
Yeah, right. There is still a lot of...
They don't turn each other in for it, which I find interesting, but
right,
it's happening.
Right. There's complaints about tampering, and there's all kinds of, again, sort of spooky stories to make everybody scared about the boogeyman of tampering, but how much it's already happening, and it's just sort of given like a, hey, like just tell your, talk to your high school coach, right? Just talk to your high school. I'm not going to talk to you. I'm not going to talk directly to the player, but I'll talk to your high school coach. You talk to your high school coach, and we'll make this work. Because that goes on all the time. And even with the portal, I think it's still happening. The other interesting thing with the portal, and I will let you run after this because I know we want to wrap this up eventually, is I am interested to see what happens more now with coaches sort of doing the Justin Fuente. Now, Justin Fuente came out and said, if you go into the portal, I am considering you gone. You can't come back.
Yeah.
The idea of entering and coming back, I don't think is what people thought of when the portal was created, because they didn't want to place a situation where, like, as soon as you step in, you're gone. I don't think they felt like that wasn't fair to the athletes. And the other thing that was discovered is the coaches realize, well, I might want that guy back. Like in some ways, it behooves me to let him take a pass through there, check things out. Maybe the kid's just upset. He had a bad semester. He just needs to blow off some steam. He'll go into the portal, do it, and come. Because guys do. They step in and they come back. I am wondering how that evolves over the next few years, and if they might consider putting some, either A, coaches themselves make it team rules. Hey, you go in, you can't come back. Or, and I've discussed this at an NCAA level, and they don't seem to have a good idea of how they can do it without it being unfair to the kids and creating some unfortunate circumstances where now kids just have no scholarships. But this idea of limiting how long you can go in, if you can go in and come back, I still think that that's a hole in this system that might need to be patched.
I agree. I think if you go back and read like the original press releases about what this was going to be, the intent of this was to let them explore transfer, not to hop on a website and get recruited and leave and that's it. It was to explore the possibility of being recruited. That doesn't mean coaches have to, treat it that way. And so you have seen Justin Fuente, and I've talked to other coaches. Others don't say it, don't really want to say it publicly, but they're absolutely going to run off a guy that does it. You look at the portal right now in this cycle since August. Like I said, there's, I think, 1,150 players that have gone in the portal, and less than 50 have withdrawn, right? And I think that number's pretty low and pretty concerning. Now, there are going to be some coaches that if a player goes in the portal, he should probably expect to see his items in his locker, in a box the next day.
Right. And
there are going to be some kids who the coaches are going to be, sitting down in meetings and trying to talk through things and trying to figure out how to, find a way to get them to come back. So it's all very case by case. But yeah, I would hope that, David Shaw took a little bit of a different approach this offseason. He told his players who were going to be graduates, feel free to put your name in there and see what you can find. And they had, it was pretty publicized that they had more than a dozen guys in the portal, but all of them were grad transfers and guys looking for maybe where to play. And a few of them have come back. I think that's an interesting approach that kind of takes a little bit of the ego out of it. And you'd like to see more coaches say, you know what, if you want to explore it, I understand that. And, it is hard for them to hold that spot. But you would like to see it be a little bit more of an exploratory thing and not just a done deal, because some of these kids ultimately are making a mistake in thinking that there's something out there that's going to be a lot better.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a good legislative solution. I talk about like a patch or having something that could fill that. But in reality, what really should be filling that is just good faith player and coach relations. Really, you want it to be a situation where we will work this out amongst ourselves on a case-by-case basis, and the coaches will do the right things. And the players, quite frankly, they have to take some responsibility too, will do the right things for everybody involved, and people will act within a timely manner. Because it does strike me as a place where if you tried to make rules around it, it might make things worse. Yeah,
I totally agree with you. And it is interesting. You wonder if there's some way to create it where there's a time period where they can go in or whatever. But yeah, it's, the reality is this stuff's going to change, and it's going to change pretty soon here. And I think ultimately you hope that, like, as I write about the statistics of players going in the portal and stuff, like, you just hope that they can be well educated on what are the odds that they're facing if they decide to do so, and what's the likelihood that they end up playing FCS or a lower level if they go into the portal and don't have people hitting them up. So you hope that players are making educated decisions, because at the end of the day, I do believe a lot more of them are going to go in, and there's the same amount of spots each year.
Max Olson from The Athletic, thank you so much for the long and insightful conversation. I took you a little longer than I hoped for, Max. I hope I didn't make you late for anything. But thanks
All
so
good,
much
friend.
Thanks so much for getting together with me during the off season to hit a little news and relevant topics.
All right, appreciate it, buddy. Hope I see you soon.
Absolutely. And now 3 and out, first down. We're talking hand sizes this week, so the NFL Combine must be here. I won't watch much of the Combine, but to be fair, that's mostly because I don't get the NFL Network on my streaming service. Otherwise, I would probably be consuming far more of it than is actually healthy. Second down. And to be clear, the reason why I like watching the NFL Combine when I have a chance to is not because I think it dramatically changes the draft stock of players. I'm not moving guys up and down my board. For the most part, it doesn't do that. For the most part, the film tells the story on the player. I get drawn in by just how crazy athletic these guys are. When I was young, I loved superheroes and still eat up all the Marvel movies. Elite athletes nowadays are almost like real-life superheroes. I am amazed at the things that they can do, which seems so far beyond the capacity of mere humans. Third down. Last word on the move of Scott Cochran from Alabama to Georgia. I want to stress that I can't imagine one man moving from Tuscaloosa to Athens is going to swing the power in the SEC toward the east, and this is how Georgia will overtake the Tide. That would be silly. But continuity has value in college football, and Cochran has provided that for Saban more than any other person when it has been lacking throughout the on-field coaching staff at Alabama. Ultimately, if Georgia and Kirby Smart are going to achieve their goal of catching Alabama and becoming the dominant program in the SEC, really throughout college football, it will be done on the recruiting trail. The Bulldogs have been recruiting at an Alabama level for 4 years. And if adding Cochran can help swing the advantage toward the Bulldogs, then he is worth every penny. I'm confident losing Cochran will not end the Alabama dynasty. I'm just as confident that this is a loss of significance to Alabama. We'll be able to quantify just how much Alabama loses and Georgia gains in a few years. That's the show for today. I'd like to thank my producer, Warren Levinson, for making me sound good. You can find this podcast on Apple Podcast and at Westwood One Podcast. Please subscribe so you do not miss an episode. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. Thanks for listening, and come back for more next week of the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast.
This podcast is presented by Regions Bank. You're chasing your goals, and it's up to you how you want to get there. Let Regions Bank coach you with financial tips that fit your everyday grind. Visit regions.com/next-step to learn more. Regions, member FDIC.